I worked hard to support my man's dream with my inheritance money, but Mill hosted a party and blamed me. I corrected her in front of everyone. I, 33F, have been married to my husband, 34M, for 5 years. We met at a concert when I was 25 and I really liked how charming and laid back he was. It was what attracted me to him initially. We exchanged numbers and went out for a few days, and within a few months, we decided that we wanted to be with each other. He was working as an IT professional when I met him, but he'd always wanted to be a drummer. He even had a band in college and had kept in touch with his friends. Unfortunately, music gigs hardly ever paid well unless you were famous, and it's just a really unstable and risky career option in general. It's sad, but it's true. So he stuck to his IT job and would only get together with his bandmates and play small gigs on the weekends as a hobby. I am a registered nurse, which everyone knows is a really taxing job. So a year into our relationship, we decided to move in together because the commute from work to his house and then back to my house was becoming too much for me. We've been living together since then, and it's been difficult because only after moving in with my husband did I realize that he's a bit of a slob, so I constantly have to clean up after him. After a long day working in a hospital, the last thing I want to do after coming back home is clean up after him because he can't be bothered too. There's also the fact that he's bad with money, so I have to handle all the finances myself and make sure he doesn't purchase unnecessary crap like he used to when he was a bachelor. He literally had one part of his bedroom occupied by a bunch of his musical instruments that he'd tried to learn and then given up midway. I'm just thankful that his drum set was in the garage of his bandmate's house where they got together to practice. I made him get rid of a lot of things, sell off some, and basically brought his life under control. He was resistant at first, but I made it very clear that if we were going to be living together, then he had to be clean and he absolutely had to be responsible with his money. He'd already been late with his rent several times and often wouldn't be able to pay his bills on time because of his lifestyle. So once I moved in with him, all that came to an end. I'd like to think that this was a good thing that I did for him, but unfortunately, my mother-in-law doesn't agree with that. My husband introduced me to his family 6 months into our relationship, and I'd expected a really warm welcome since he'd only ever had wonderful things to say about his mother, but that wasn't that. She was very cold and distant and didn't put in any effort to be nice to me at all. She wasn't cruel case to me like a lot of mother-in-laws are, but she wasn't sweet or enthusiastic about me either. And she had a lot to say about how I was changing everything about her son. She said that her son was being forced to end his youth earlier than expected because he just wasn't allowed to have fun anymore, thanks to his new ball and chain, referring to me. She tried to pass those comments off as jokes, but I knew that she didn't like what I was doing. I didn't say anything to her because as long as my husband didn't have an issue with me changing his lifestyle for the better, I didn't care what his mother thought. Since then, we've been civil to each other for the sake of my husband's sanity, but that's all. We don't speak to each other unless we're with family, and even then, we keep it short and try to avoid talking as much as possible. I don't know if my husband's ever picked up on that, and even if he has, he knew better than to interfere. This is the way it's been ever since I started dating him, and we've been okay with it up until a few weeks ago. So my uncle recently passed away, and he happened to be really wealthy. He was the CEO of his own company and made a fortune from it. He didn't have any wife or kids of his own, so I ended up inheriting half of his wealth while the other half went to my mother. My uncle had been close when I was little, and even after that, I'd kept in touch with him. He'd visit during the holidays and it'd always be a laugh riot with him around, so of course I did love him and I was mourning him. I could celebrate the inheritance later because that didn't mean as much to me as my uncle did. It's a huge amount and is enough for me to get by comfortably for a really long time, and I'd celebrate that later, but first, I needed some time to process my uncle's passing. But my husband, like an insensitive idiot, decided to talk about the money literally just an hour after we returned from the funeral and the reading of his will. He said that now that we were rich, he could finally afford to quit his job and pursue his dream of becoming a drummer full-time. I was already very upset because I'd just returned from the funeral for someone I really loved, and instead of consoling me, he decided to start talking about what we could do with the money we'd inherited. So I had a bit of an angry outburst and I told him that we hadn't inherited the money I had, and I would decide what to do with it. Of course, I did intend on using the money for both of us, but at that moment, I ended up saying I didn't really mean out of anger, which led to a huge fight. My husband started accusing me of never letting him have any fun, never supporting his dreams, and always nagging him about money. And now that we finally had a crapload of money, I was still refusing to share that with him, even though for these past 5 years, he'd been doing everything he could, keeping his dreams aside for the sake of my happiness. I didn't like that at all because firstly, none of this was for the sake of my happiness. If he didn't want to change his way of living and become a more responsible person, then he should have just broken up with me, and then he could have continued to live his bachelor lifestyle. But if you're getting into a relationship and having them move in with you, then you should be ready for the responsibilities that come with it. So we argued about that for about an hour, and there was a lot of shouting and name calling because both of us were really bad. We didn't speak for the next few days, and this was probably our biggest and most serious fight ever. I was hurting, but I didn't want to break the ice and talk to him first because whatever I'd said had been said in a moment of anger, but whatever he'd said were his true feelings that he'd allowed to build up over the years. However, yesterday, he finally spoke to me in the morning. He said that he was sorry about whatever he'd said and wanted to take back whatever he'd said. So I did the same because I was ready to go back to normalcy now. The silent treatment just doesn't sit right with me. And besides, it's our wedding anniversary today, so I didn't want to be fighting with him on this special day. So we agreed to stop fighting and that we'd discuss this later after we'd both thought things through individually, since that seemed like the best way to deal with something as sensitive as this. He also told me that his mother was hosting a dinner in honor of our 5th wedding anniversary today, and even though I didn't want to spend my evening with my mother-in-law, I agreed to it because he promised that we'd take a trip to the hills really soon that we'd been postponing for ages because of work. So with that in mind, I decided to attend this dinner because it was just one evening, after all, and it really couldn't be that bad. Also, my mother-in-law was putting in an effort to do something nice for the first time, so I thought that I should reciprocate by attending happily. And so I put on my best clothes, even got my hair blown out, and we left for my Mills house towards the evening. Once we got there, I noticed that my mother-in-law had actually decorated her house beautifully and everything looked very elegant. I was quite impressed by the effort she'd put in, considering our relationship. When I complimented her on the arrangements she'd made, she replied by saying that her son had finally given her a reason to celebrate, so she was pulling out all the stops. I was kind of thrown off by that comment because we'd been married for 5 years and she'd never done anything so special for us. I wasn't pregnant either, so I had no idea what her cryptic remark meant, but I didn't have much time to think about it since I had to socialize with the guests as well and soon forgot about it. After a while, dinner was finally served, but before my husband or I could say anything, my mother-in-law raised a glass and I obviously thought that she was raising a toast to 5 years of our marriage. But then she went on to say that this toast was for her son, who'd worked hard enough to retire early and could finally pursue his dream of being a professional drummer now. She even mentioned how he'd done it without any support, looking straight at me, and said that he'd risen above the odds and fought against all the people who'd discouraged him from doing what he wanted to, but despite that, he was finally going to do what he'd been born to do, and she was proud of him. I was absolutely lost and could barely make sense of what she was saying, so I looked towards my husband who was sitting right beside me and he whispered the truth to me. He said that he'd told his mother that he planned on quitting his job soon and going back to being a full-time drummer, but he couldn't tell her that he was going to rely on my inheritance because she'd never accept that, so he told her that he'd saved up enough on his own and could finally afford it. I was furious because obviously, I hadn't agreed to any of this yet. I didn't want him to go back to music, not just because it was an unstable career, but because he was not good enough to make it on his own. He's an amateur at best, but nowhere near as good as people who can afford to be a full-time musician, and also, just because I've inherited a lot of money doesn't automatically mean that he can go back to his spendthrift ways. That's not how this works, and I wasn't going to let him believe that he was, in any way, entitled to that money. What really stung the most was the comment that his mother had made about me never supporting him, because that simply wasn't true, and both my husband and I knew that. I'd supported him every step of the way and made him stay on track for his own good and for our future. And my husband hadn't even bothered to stand up for me when his mother accused me of being unsupportive. So I decided that I'd had enough of their crap and it was about time that I stood up for myself, and that's what I did. I decided to make a speech of my own even though my husband was trying to shush me. I stood up, looked right at my mother-in-law, and told her the entire truth. That her son hadn't worked any harder than I did, and wouldn't have been able to afford to retire for another 50 years at the very least if I wasn't there to keep him in check, because he was a man-child whose mother had never taught him the value of money. And also the so-called wealth that she was bragging about was actually money that I'd inherited from my uncle, which was now going to be all mine because I was done with her and her son. The family had been shocked enough at my mother-in-law's speech, but mine certainly took the cake because their mouths were actually open. My own parents, who were also present there, were the only ones who were smiling. After saying what I had to say, I left without another word, even though my husband was trying to stop me and calling my name. I took the car and drove to a hotel nearby to clear my mind, because after what had happened, I just couldn't go home and pretend everything was fine again. It's been 2 hours since I arrived and I've finally cooled down a little, but it's still extremely difficult for me to come to terms with what my husband did. I'd put up with everything for so long, but I can't just go on this way anymore. He himself has never been hardworking, and in 5 years, has received an increment only twice because he's just lousy when it comes to work. I get that he's just never been very interested in his job, but he can't just give up, not when he still has bills to pay. And on top of that, his mother had the audacity to accuse me of being unsupportive when it's always been me who's tried my best to encourage him to follow his passion, but reasonably, instead of just diving headfirst into an unstable career and inviting financial trouble for himself, unlike his mother who thinks that her son not having fun is the end of the world. I just don't understand why he'd even tell his mother these things when we hadn't even discussed it in the first place. He's been texting me nonstop since I left, but I haven't even opened the texts because I really don't want to know what he has to say right now. I'm really pissed off about whatever happened today, and I don't think an apology through text is going to fix anything. I just need to know if my anger is justified or if I'm overreacting. So Ida, for telling my mother-in-law the truth about her son after she accused me of being unsupportive? Hey, everyone. I'd firstly just like to thank everyone for all the warmth and advice. Really, thanks for taking time out of your day to send me kind messages, and it really does mean a lot to me. I'm still staying at the hotel, but I did speak to my husband this morning. It's been 2 days and I finally thought that it was about time that I answered him. I didn't know what to expect, but then I finally read all his texts in the morning before calling him and telling him to wait for me at home before he leaves for work. In his texts, he'd just been apologizing again and again for whatever trouble he'd stirred and promised me that he had no idea that his mother would do something like this. If he'd known, he never would have asked me to attend in the first place. He didn't say much else and just kept requesting me to talk to him so that he could explain what happened, and I wanted to know how he could explain any of this, which is why I agreed to meet him. When I went back home to meet him, he explained to me that the evening before he apologized, he'd been talking to his mother on the phone and he'd ended up telling her that he just didn't want to continue working anymore and he wanted to quit his job to become a drummer, but I was forcing him to work. He didn't mention the inheritance because he knew his mother wouldn't like the idea of him living off of my inheritance. So his mother, true to character, told him that he must do what he wants to and he shouldn't let me dictate the way he lives. She also said that I was the one stopping him from living his life to the fullest, and that sort of got to him because we were already in the middle of a fight and his mother was just adding fuel to the fire. He said that he'd speak to me about it, and if I still opposed his decision to quit his job then he'd leave me, and that made his mother really happy. Which is not very surprising. The next day though, he realized that he was being stupid and so he apologized to me, but he still had his mother to answer to, and when she called him that evening, he had to lie to her to avoid any more conversations about this. He told her that we'd talked about things and he'd managed to convince me, and I'd agreed only after he'd threatened to leave me. His mom wasn't too happy that we weren't actually getting divorced, but she was glad that he was finally going to be the musician he was born to be, according to her. Then, she told him that she'd throw the anniversary party for us, and that's how this all happened. So he'd lied to his mother just to cover up his own indecisiveness, and then lied some more and made me seem like an unsupportive wife just to appease his mother. He saw nothing wrong with just throwing me under the bus to justify his own actions, and even while he was telling me about it, he was trying to make himself seem like a victim who was caught between his mom and his wife. All these years, I'd been looking out for this man, and if that meant some tough love in the form of restrictions, then I was willing to do that as well for him. It was only today that I finally realized that I wasn't a wife at all. I'd been parenting him this entire time, and it was eye-opening, to say the least. He was not the victim of anything at all. I was the victim of marriage to a freaking man-child, and when I finally realized it, I decided that I was done and dusted. If he wanted to ruin his own life by quitting his job and becoming a mediocre drummer in a band, then he was welcome to do so, but I wasn't going to be part of that. I packed some of my things up while he tried to talk to me and begged me to stay, but I was done. I told him that I wasn't going to baby him anymore, and now, he was on his own. He didn't have to worry about a nagging wife now and could pursue his dreams and ambitions without me pulling him down. Then, I left and blocked him everywhere because I just didn't want to hear from him anymore. I'm heartbroken right now, but I know that this marriage is now over. I tried really hard to make it work, but unfortunately, I'm now well aware that it's never going to work. My husband and I are just fundamentally way too different to be together, and I get that now. He's always been lazy, and that stands true for everything he's tried his hand at. He's been a lousy employee, which is why he's still working for the same salary that he used to 5 years back, while I've made significant progress in my career since then. The only thing that had managed to keep us together this entire time was my love for him and hope that someday, he might change. Clearly, that's never going to happen. And I'm just so sick of waiting around for him to suddenly realize that I was trying to improve his life and not ruin it. He's on his own now, and so am I. Some of you misogynistic us need to realize that not every woman is built the same. I don't understand why people are accusing me of abandoning my husband as soon as I had more money than him. I always earned more than him, so this was never about the money in the first place. If I was actually a gold digger, then why would I be with someone who earns less than I do? And also, I obviously would have shared the money with my husband had he bothered to have a civil discussion with me about it at an appropriate time instead of fighting with me over it when I was grieving. I think that's pretty much just common sense. And for everyone who's saying that I sound like I really wasn't supportive of his passion for music, I'm sorry, but it's easier said than done. Like I said, my husband never bothered to work hard on his skills, and so he was an amateur at best, so there's just no hope for him to make it as a professional. He can try, but I don't think he wants to put in the time or effort. He really isn't that good, and in spite of that, I go to all his gigs and even paid for some lessons which he eventually stopped going to because they're doing it all wrong. The instructors were trained professionals and he's self-taught, so enough said there. I tried my best to be supportive, but it's not an easy task when you're working long hours so you can pay all your bills while your husband plays the fool with his drum set. Ultimately, I've received more love here than hate, so it doesn't really matter, but I feel like I owed everyone an explanation as to why exactly things weren't ever going to work out. For him, his music and his mother were always going to come before me, and I was sick of putting him first when it was so clear that he'd never do the same for me. Coming to why exactly I was so hell-bent on saving the money, that's a sensitive area for me, which is why I hadn't talked about it earlier. I'm in my 30s now and still childless, but I really do want a kid, and my husband knows that. We've been trying for a long time without success, so I thought that we'd attempt IVF now, or else we'd look into adoption or surrogacy. I'd assumed that we'd save this money for our future child, but he cares about nothing except for his future as a drummer and living a rockstar lifestyle that he was used to as a bachelor when his mommy and daddy were funding his spendthrift ways. And so I'm out of here. I've even changed my number and made sure that he cannot reach me anyhow. I've also told all our common friends that I don't want to hear from him, so if he gets in touch with them and asks them to pass on any message, they don't need to do that. The next time we speak, it'll be with my lawyer. Hey, everyone, it's been a while. I finally found a lawyer a few days back and have filed for divorce. Soon enough, he's going to be served with the papers. He and his mother actually went to visit my parents so that they could apologize and find out where I was, but my parents obviously told him to get lost since they knew what he'd done and had witnessed firsthand what a horrible human being my mother-in-law was. And this apology is too little too late. It's painfully obvious that they're just doing this for the inheritance money, but I'm gonna make sure he doesn't even get to touch that. I can now afford the best lawyer and hopefully, I should be able to protect what's rightfully mine.